Welcome to a story history tried to bury, just like the man inside it. In 1873, they said he was dead. His body was placed in a coffin, the lid was sealed, and the earth closed above him. But what happened next was so terrifying that even eyewitnesses refused to believe it. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from.
It's heavy, keep at it!
I read every
Almost
single
there.
one. And if you value stories built on real records, court documents, and forgotten archives, make sure you subscribe, because uncovering true history like this takes relentless research, patience, and courage. Now, let's go back to 1873. America in 1873 was a nation pretending to move forward while still chained to its past. Slavery had been officially abolished years earlier, but freedom existed mostly on paper. For millions of formerly enslaved people, daily life barely changed. They worked the same land, answered to the same white landowners, and lived under laws designed to keep them powerless. Reconstruction promised equality, but in reality, it delivered uncertainty, fear, and quiet violence. Southern states were rebuilding their economies on the backs of black labor through sharecropping and debt peonage. Former slaves were free, yet trapped in contracts they could not read, enforced by threats they could not escape. Missing a payment, questioning an order, or simply angering the wrong man could lead to beatings, arrest, or worse. The justice system almost always sided with white masters, and black testimony was often dismissed or ignored. Racial terror was common and rarely punished. Night riders, secret groups, and local militias enforced obedience through lynchings and public warnings. These acts were not hidden, they were meant to be seen. Fear became a tool of control, reminding black communities that stepping out of line, even after slavery, could still mean death. Survival often depended on silence. Medical care for black people was almost non-existent, and death records were careless or deliberately falsified. If a black man died, few asked how or why. Bodies were buried quickly, sometimes without proper examination, sometimes without family present. A declaration of death from a local authority was enough, even if it was wrong or convenient. Coffins in 1873 were simple wooden boxes, often reused, poorly sealed, and rushed into the ground. Funerals for black individuals were short and unceremonious, especially if the deceased had belonged to, or worked for, a powerful white man. Once buried, the story ended. No investigations, no questions, no justice. Former masters still held enormous influence. They controlled land, money, local law enforcement, and even churches. If a slave or worker died under suspicious circumstances, the master's word carried more weight than any evidence. Challenging that narrative could put an entire black family at risk. It was in this fragile, dangerous America of 1873, where truth depended on skin color and silence meant survival, that a man was declared dead far too easily. And when someone like that was buried, history assumed the grave would keep its secrets forever. He was a man most people refused to see. Even after slavery had ended, he was still spoken to as if he were property, not a person. In the eyes of the town, he was just another black laborer, quiet, obedient, and replaceable. No one bothered to learn his full name, his past, or the thoughts he kept locked behind his silence. Those who worked beside him noticed. He listened more than he spoke. He watched how the landowner moved, how the overseers argued, how deals were made and broken. People mistook his silence for ignorance, not realizing it was caution. In a world where one wrong word could lead to violence, staying quiet was a form of survival. He was often sent on the hardest tasks, the kind meant to break a man's body. Long hours in the fields, heavy lifting, nights spent outdoors with little food or rest. Complaints were met with punishment, not relief. Over time, his strength became expected, his pain invisible. The master and overseers laughed at him openly. They mocked the way he walked, the scars on his back, the fact that he never fought back. To them, he was harmless. A man without rage, a man without plans. That assumption would later prove fatal to their sense of safety. Within the black community, however, he was seen differently. Elders noticed his discipline. Children noticed his kindness. He shared food when he could and listened when others spoke of loss. But even among his own people, he rarely revealed his thoughts. He had learned that hope spoken aloud could be stolen. He understood the system better than most. He knew how easily black lives were erased, how deaths were ignored, and how quickly the world moved on. This knowledge did not make him reckless, it made him patient. Patience for him was not weakness, it was preparation. When whispers began to spread that something terrible had happened to him, few reacted with urgency. The town had already decided who he was, a man not worth believing in. And because of that, when the truth finally emerged, it shattered every assumption they had ever made. The master was a man whose power did not come from kindness or respect, but from fear. Long before 1873, he had learned that cruelty was an efficient language. He spoke it fluently, with his voice, with his fists, and with the laws that protected him. To the outside world, he presented himself as respectable a landowner, a provider of work, a man rebuilding the South. But those who lived under him knew a different truth. He believed absolute control was his right. Even after slavery was abolished, he acted as if nothing had truly changed. The people who worked his land were still treated as property in all but name. He decided who ate, who rested, who was punished, and who disappeared. Any challenge to his authority was met swiftly, meant to serve as a warning to the rest. Punishment on his land was not always loud. Sometimes it was a beating. Sometimes it was starvation. Other times it was isolation, sending a man away from his family, forcing him into impossible debt, or arranging an arrest on false charges. The cruelty was calculated, designed to break spirits rather than draw attention. Local law enforcement rarely interfered. The master paid their wages indirectly, donated to their churches, and socialized with them on weekends. When complaints were raised by black workers, they were dismissed as lies or misunderstandings. The master's version of events was always accepted first, and usually last. He took particular satisfaction in humiliating those he considered weak. Men who stayed quiet, who avoided confrontation, amused him the most. He saw their silence as submission, proof that his dominance was complete. He never considered that silence could be something else entirely. To his family and neighbors he was strict but fair. Stories of violence were brushed off as exaggerations. In public, he spoke of order, discipline, and tradition. In private, he enforced those ideals through fear. The contrast allowed him to sleep soundly at night. By 1873, the master felt untouchable. He believed the past was buried, resistance was gone, and the people beneath him would remain there forever. He had no idea that the very man he dismissed as powerless would soon become the living proof that some graves do not stay closed. The news of his death arrived suddenly and without explanation. One day he was working the land as usual, and the next, word spread that he had collapsed and never risen again. No doctor was summoned in time, no thorough examination conducted. The cause was declared quickly, almost casually, as if his life required no careful accounting. Some said he had fallen ill from exhaustion. Others whispered about a beating that went too far. A few claimed he had angered the master and paid the price in private. But these rumors never left the margins of conversation. Speaking them aloud was dangerous, and most people chose safety over truth. His body was kept out of sight. Those who might have noticed signs of injury were never given the chance. The master insisted the burial happen quickly, citing heat, decay, and the cost of delay. Speed became the excuse that silenced doubt. The faster the body disappeared, the safer the story became. There were no official records worth trusting. Death certificates for black laborers were often vague, sometimes fabricated entirely. A single signature from a local authority was enough to make the death final. Once ink touched paper, questions were considered disrespectful or rebellious. Within the black community, grief mixed with unease. Something about the death felt wrong. He had been strong. Quiet, yes, but not fragile. Elders exchanged looks they did not explain. Women lowered their voices when his name was mentioned. Instinct told them this was not a natural end. The master showed little emotion. He spoke of loss as inconvenience, of labor shortages and schedules disrupted. There was no pause for mourning, no acknowledgement of the man beyond his usefulness. To the master, the death was closed business. By nightfall, the coffin was prepared and the grave dug. The town accepted the story as it always had. Another black man gone. Another ending no one would challenge. What no one realized was that this death was not an ending at all. It was the moment everything began to unravel. The coffin was brought out before most people even understood what had happened. Rough wood, hastily cut, still smelling of sap and dust, as if it had been prepared without care or patience. There was no proper viewing, no time allowed for family or friends to stand close and say goodbye. The lid remained shut, and that alone unsettled those who noticed. A few men were instructed to lift the body inside, but they were rushed, warned not to linger. The master stood nearby, watching, his voice sharp whenever someone slowed down. He insisted the body had already begun to change, that it was better this way, better not to look, better not to ask. The words sounded practical, but the urgency felt forced. No one checked for breath. No one searched for a pulse. In those days, especially for black laborers, death was often assumed rather than confirmed. A man unconscious, weak, or badly injured could easily be mistaken for dead, and once that assumption was made, there was rarely any effort to challenge it. The nails were driven in quickly, too quickly. Each hammer strike echoed in the quiet air, sharp and final. Some swore they saw a faint movement beneath the cloth, but fear kept their eyes fixed on the ground. Others later claimed they heard a sound, a soft shift, a breath trapped in wood. At the time, they said nothing. Those who helped carry the coffin noticed its weight, felt wrong. Not the heavy stillness of a lifeless body, but something uneven, something that did not settle. When one man hesitated, the master snapped at him to move faster. The moment passed, buried under obedience. The burial followed immediately. No prayers spoken aloud, no long ceremony. The coffin was lowered, ropes pulled away, and earth shoveled down in thick, final layers. Each mound of dirt felt like a door being sealed, not just over a body, but over the truth itself. By the time the grave was filled, the sun was already sinking. The master turned and walked away without looking back. To him, the matter was finished. But for those who had witnessed the haste, the silence, and the closed lid, a quiet dread remained, an unspoken fear that something had been locked away far too soon. That night, the area around the burial ground refused to stay quiet. Long after the last footsteps faded and the master had returned home, strange noises drifted through the darkness. At first, they were so faint they could be mistaken for wind moving through trees or animals stirring in the brush, but those who lived closest to the grave knew the difference between nature and something else. A low, hollow sound carried through the soil, as if the earth itself were unsettled. Dogs began to whine and pace, pulling at their chains, refusing to lie down. Horses grew restless in their stalls, stamping and snorting without reason. Animals sensed what people tried to ignore. Some claimed they heard muffled thuds coming from beneath the ground, spaced unevenly, not like falling dirt or shifting roots. Others described it as scratching, slow, deliberate, desperate. The sounds came and went, never lasting long enough to draw a crowd, but long enough to plant fear. A nearby family sat awake with lamps lit, whispering prayers. They debated waking others, but fear held them back. Accusing the dead of being alive sounded like madness, and madness could bring punishment. In 1873, being wrong was dangerous, especially for black families. As the hours passed, the noises grew weaker, then stopped altogether. Silence returned, heavy and final. Some took this as proof that they had imagined everything. Others felt something worse, that whatever had been struggling was now conserving strength, not gone. By morning, rumors had already begun to spread. No one spoke loudly, but eyes met in understanding. Something had happened during the night, something that should not have been possible. When daylight reached the grave, nothing appeared disturbed. The soil lay smooth, the mound untouched. To anyone looking quickly, it was just another burial. But those who had listened in the dark knew the truth. Whatever was placed in that coffin had not accepted its fate quietly. The next night, the air around the graveyard felt different, thicker, as if the darkness itself had weight. People who lived nearby kept their doors locked and their lamps burning, refusing to leave windows open. Even the bravest men stayed inside, unwilling to walk where the ground had already shown signs of resistance. Around midnight, a sound broke through the silence, a sharp, sudden noise, like wood striking wood. It came from the direction of the burial mound. The nearby families froze, listening as if their ears were the only weapons they had. Then came another sound, a dull thud, followed by a faint scraping. It was unmistakable, like something pushing against the inside of the coffin. A small group of men gathered quietly, armed only with lanterns and the courage of fear. They approached the grave in silence, stepping carefully over the grass. The moonlight made the mound look ordinary, but the men could feel the ground vibrating beneath their feet, a subtle tremor that made their stomachs turn. When they reached the edge of the grave, one man leaned closer and saw something that made his blood run cold. The soil on the top was disturbed, freshly shifted, as if someone had pressed upward from below. It was not a collapse, not a sinking of dirt. It looked like an upward movement, a force pushing from inside the earth. The men shouted, not to warn anyone, but to break the spell of fear that gripped them. They began to dig, shovels cutting through the soft dirt. The deeper they went, the heavier the air felt. Each scoop of soil seemed to resist, as if the ground itself was holding back. And then, when the shovels finally reached the coffin, a sound echoed, a low, desperate thump from inside. The men stopped, paralyzed. The coffin lid, once firmly nailed, now showed signs of strain. The wood had splintered at one corner, as if something inside had forced its way against the nails. It was not a gentle movement. It was the movement of a man refusing to be buried. The grave was no longer just a burial site. It was now a scene of something living, something that had refused to remain silent. And as the men stared at the broken wood, they realized the impossible truth. The coffin had been disturbed from the inside. When the coffin was finally opened, the air around it felt as if it had been waiting. The men who had dug it up held their breath, expecting the worst, but nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. The lid creaked open, and the smell of damp earth and old wood rose up like a warning. Inside, the body was not the lifeless, broken form they expected. It was a man, alive, and glaring back at them with eyes that held a fury no grave could contain. His skin was bruised and pale, but his breathing was steady, controlled. His hands were scratched and bloody from forcing at the wood. His clothes were torn, as if he had struggled for hours inside the coffin, desperate to break free. He did not look like a man who had simply survived. He looked like a man who had been reborn through pain. The men recoiled, stepping back as if the coffin itself was dangerous. One of them tried to speak, but his voice cracked, and the words died in his throat. The man inside the coffin did not speak either. He stared, silent and unblinking, as if he was assessing whether they were still part of the world that had tried to bury him. His eyes were not confused. They were focused. There was no surprise, no panic, only cold determination. It was as if he had expected this moment, as if he had planned it in the dark. He slowly lifted his head, and the men saw the shape of his face change. His expression was not of a man rescued, it was of a man awakened. As the men struggled to understand what they were seeing, the man in the coffin pushed himself upward. His movements were slow but powerful, like a force that had been stored for too long. He rose out of the coffin, covered in dirt, his body shaking with effort. When he stood, he did not look weak. He looked dangerous. For a moment, no one moved. The graveyard felt like a suspended world, caught between death and life. Then the man stepped out of the coffin, not running, not begging, but walking with a quiet, terrifying purpose. The sight of him was enough to make even the strongest men question everything they thought they knew about the dead. The man's return wasn't dramatic or chaotic. There were no screams, no frantic running, only a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself had stopped to watch. He walked away from the grave, as if he owned the ground beneath him, his steps slow but deliberate. The men who had opened the coffin remained frozen, unsure whether to chase him or flee. They were caught between fear and disbelief, and neither option felt safe. Word spread quickly, but not through official channels. People whispered in doorways, in churches, and at markets. The story traveled like a dark wind. "He's alive," arose from the grave. They buried him alive. Every retelling added a new layer of horror, and every version shared the same impossible truth. The man had returned. The master, when he heard, refused to believe it at first. His pride wouldn't allow him to accept that a man he had buried could still walk. He accused the community of lying, of making up a story to cause trouble. But his denial was not convincing. He knew, deep down, that his power had been challenged in a way he could not control. The man did not hide. He did not beg for mercy. He walked openly through the area, his presence a living accusation. People saw him pass and felt the air shift. Those who had known him before recognized his face, but his eyes were different now. They carried a fire that could not be extinguished. He did not go to the master's home immediately. Instead, he went where the pain was deepest, toward the places that had held his suffering. He visited the fields where he had been forced to work, the barns where he had been beaten, and the paths where he had been watched. His return was not about escape. It was about remembering. The community watched from a distance, too afraid to intervene, too shocked to speak. They knew the consequences of being associated with a man who had defied death. Yet they also felt something else, an unspoken hope that someone had finally found the courage to stand against the cruelty that had haunted them for years. And then, in the quiet between moments, the man's purpose became clear. He wasn't returning for forgiveness. He was returning to confront the very people who believed they could bury him and forget him. The revenge he sought was not just personal. It was a message to anyone who still thought they could control life and death. His revenge didn't come as a single violent outburst. It came as a slow, deliberate unraveling, an act of justice carried out in silence. The man did not chase the master like a desperate animal. He waited, watched, and chose the moment when the master believed himself saestum. He understood the system, and he knew that the most terrifying form of revenge was the one that struck where people felt most secure. The first signs were small and subtle. Tools went missing from the master's barn. A fence that had always been strong suddenly collapsed, not from weather, but from something forced to fail. Horses were found wounded, not killed, but clearly attacked. Each incident seemed accidental at first, the kind of thing that could be blamed on bad luck or poor maintenance. But the pattern grew impossible to ignore. The master began to feel the fear that he had once inflicted on others. His men whispered about the dead man haunting the property, and even the bravest workers began to avoid the fields after sunset. He tried to increase patrols and punish those he suspected, but the revenge was not being carried out by an obvious enemy. It was happening in the shadows, where he could not control it. Then came the moment that made the master understand the depth of what he had done. One night, while he was alone in his home, the man appeared without warning, not as a ghost, not as a rumor, but as a living, breathing presence standing in the doorway. The master's face turned pale, his body frozen. He realized the grave had not only failed to hold the man, it had failed to erase him. The man did not attack immediately. He stood there, watching the master's fear grow. His silence was a weapon. The master had always believed he could intimidate others into obedience, but now he was the one being intimidated. The tables had turned, and the master hated the feeling of helplessness. When the man finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. He did not demand forgiveness. He did not ask for mercy. He spoke only to make the master understand that the power had shifted. He reminded him of the pain, the beatings, the humiliation, the night he had been buried alive. Every word was a reminder that the master's authority was built on cruelty, and cruelty could be returned. By the time the man left the house, the master was changed. He was no longer confident. He was no longer certain of his control. He had been forced to confront the fact that his cruelty had created a monster, one that did not need to kill to destroy him. The revenge had been delivered, not with blood, but with fear, humiliation, and the knowledge that the dead could still come back for those who thought they were untouchable. After the master's life began to unravel, the people around him reacted in ways that exposed their own fear. Witnesses who had once claimed the man was dead suddenly became uncertain in their stories. Some said they never saw the burial at all. Others insisted the coffin had been sealed properly, but admitted they heard noises later. The more they spoke, the more their memories shifted, as if the truth was too dangerous to hold. Those who had helped carry the coffin became especially quiet. In private, they admitted to one another that something had felt wrong from the start. Too fast, too rushed, too controlled. But when anyone else asked, they changed their answers. They told the official story because the official story was safer. Admitting the truth meant admitting they had been part of a crime. Even the master's men began to doubt their loyalty. They had been trained to obey without question, but now they faced a reality that could not be explained by rules. Some of them started avoiding the master's presence, making excuses, pretending illness or travel. They did not want to be connected to what was happening. They feared the man's return, but they also feared the consequences of telling the truth. The community's elders, who had always been cautious, suddenly became more cautious still. They warned their families not to talk about the incident, not to spread rumors. In a world where black lives were already fragile, the idea of being punished for speaking was not theoretical, it was real. Silence was not just a habit, it was a survival strategy. When authorities arrived to investigate, they found contradictory accounts. Some witnesses claimed the man had been dead and buried for days before the disturbance. Others insisted he had been alive, but they were unsure how he survived. The master insisted he was innocent, but the evidence of the disturbed grave and the missing tools made the situation impossible to ignore. Everyone was trapped in a web of fear and lies. The master tried to force the witnesses to stay loyal, threatening punishment if they spoke against him. But fear is not easily controlled once it has been planted. The more the master tried to silence the truth, the more the truth grew in the shadows. People began to wonder if the man had not only returned for revenge, but also to expose the lies that kept the system alive. In the end, the most haunting part of the story was not the man's revenge itself. It was how quickly the people around him tried to erase it. Their changing stories revealed the deep truth. The community had been complicit in his burial, and they were terrified of the consequences of admitting it. The truth was not just frightening because it was supernatural. It was frightening because it was real. After the events began to unfold, the story spread like wildfire, but not in the official records. Newspapers ignored it, and local officials pretended it never happened. The master used his influence to control the narrative, and the community, frightened and desperate, complied. The result was a story that was never fully documented, a truth that was buried deeper than the man himself. Historians later faced the same problem. When they searched for evidence, they found gaps where records should have been. Death certificates were missing or incomplete. Witness accounts conflicted. The master's name appeared in land records and legal documents, but there was no official proof of the burial or the resurrection. It was as if the event had been scrubbed from history by those who feared it most. The lack of evidence did not stop rumors from surviving. The story lived on through oral tradition, whispered from one generation to the next. Families passed it down in hushed tones, warning their children about the dangers of cruelty and the power of those who were forced to suffer in silence. The man's name became a legend, one that people were afraid to say aloud. But even the legend was not safe. As decades passed, the tale was distorted, turned into superstition, or dismissed as folklore. Some claimed it was simply a case of a man waking from a coma. Others said it was a trick, a prank, or a fabricated story meant to frighten. The truth was too dangerous to be allowed to remain clear. What makes this case haunting is not just the idea of a man rising from a coffin. It's the fact that the world he lived in was built to raise people like him. His life was already undervalued. His death was expected to be forgotten. And yet, he defied that fate. He forced the world to confront what it had tried to bury. The man's revenge, whether real or believed, exposed a deeper truth about power. The master believed he could control life and death, but the man proved otherwise. The system that allowed cruelty to flourish depended on silence and forgetting. Once that silence was broken, the system became unstable, and that is why history tried to erase him. Not because his story was impossible, but because it was too dangerous. It challenged the belief that those in power could do anything without consequence. It proved that even the dead could rise, and that the truth, once spoken, cannot be buried forever.